There is a moment that defines a life, not a graduation, not a wedding, not the birth of a child or the death of a parent. Those moments matter deeply and permanently. But the moment that defines a life is usually smaller than any of those. It happens in a tent or a parking lot or a kitchen at midnight. It happens when no one is expecting it, including the person it happens to. For Jenny Caldwell, that moment happened on a Saturday afternoon in late August 1974 at the Madison County Fair in northeastern Nebraska when she was 17 years old and standing at a microphone in front of 200 people who were about to change her life by trying to end it. She had rehearsed what she would say. She had practiced in the bathroom mirrors every morning for 3 weeks. She had whispered the words into her pillow at night until they felt smooth and certain in her mouth. But nothing in 3 weeks of preparation had accounted for the heat inside that tent. The thick, sun-baked air that smelled of popcorn and livestock and cut grass. The rows of folding chairs filled with farmers and their wives and their children. People she had known her entire life, people who had watched her grow up, people who knew exactly who Jenny Caldwell was and exactly what she could and could not do. She walked to the microphone. Her boots were clean. Her mother had made sure of that, scrubbing them the night before with an old toothbrush until the leather shone. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her hands were at her sides. She gripped the microphone stand. The crowd settled into the particular silence of an audience waiting to be entertained. Not hostile, not cruel, just waiting. The way a crowd always waits before it decides what to feel. Jenny opened her mouth, and the words caught. They did not come out broken or twisted or embarrassing. They simply did not come out at all. They piled up somewhere behind her, teeth a traffic jam, with no exit, and the silence stretched 1 second, then 2, then 3, and she could feel the shift in the crowd, that subtle change in posture and attention that meant something unexpected was happening, something that required a different kind of watching. She tried again. My name is Jay. My name is Jenny Caldwell. The stutter moved through the tent like a current. She watched it cross the faces in front of her. The confusion first, then recognition, then something that began at the corners of mouths and built quietly toward laughter. She kept going. I want to be an auctioneer. The laughter broke open, not all at once. It started somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a single sharp laugh that couldn't contain itself, and then it spread the way. Laughter always spreads in a place where there is nowhere to go and nothing else to listen to. Within seconds, it was everywhere. Not vicious, not calculated, just the honest, unguarded laughter of people who had been surprised. A stuttering girl, wanting to be an auctioneer, the one job in the world built entirely on the speed and precision of human speech. Jenny stood at that microphone while the laughter washed over her, and she did not run, and she did not cry, and she did not look at her shoes. She looked at the crowd. She let her eyes move across all those familiar faces with their open mouths and their shaking shoulders, and she found her anchor somewhere in the back of her own chest, somewhere below the shame and the heat and the noise, and she held on to it. Then a voice rose above the laughter, a voice built for rising above things. Dale Richmond was sitting in the front row. He always sat in the front row at events like this, not because he wanted a better view, but because he understood that being seen was its own form of power. He was a large man, 6 feet 3 inches and 240 pounds, with the kind of physical presence that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. He had 3,000 acres of Madison County farmland, a grain elevator, a controlling interest in the local bank, and more favors owed to him than anyone had ever bothered to count. When Dale Richmond spoke, the laughter didn't stop. It organized itself around his voice. Sweetie, he said, and the word landed in the tent like something thrown. Sweetie, auctioneering is no place for a girl. He paused, and the pause was deliberate, the pause of a man who knew exactly how to use silence, especially one who can't finish a sentence. The laughter sharpened. Jenny felt it in her sternum. Not the laughter, the word, sweetie, the way it reduced everything she was to something small and manageable and easy to dismiss. The way it assumed she didn't already know every argument against her. The way it assumed she hadn't already argued with herself in the dark and decided anyway. She looked at Dale Richmond. He was smiling, not meanly. That was the worst part. He was smiling the way a man smiles when he believes he is being generous, when he believes he is simply telling a truth that someone else is too foolish or too young to already know. Jenny tightened her grip on the microphone stand. Something happened in that moment, something she would spend years trying to describe and never fully manage. It was not courage exactly. Courage implies fear overcome, and what Jenny felt was not the absence of fear, but something that existed alongside it, something older and quieter and more patient than fear. It was the feeling of a decision being made in a place below words, a place where all the years of silence and shame and swallowed sentences had been building toward exactly this. She leaned into the microphone. "Someday, Mr. Richmond," she said. The words came slower than she wanted, each one a small battle won. "Someday I'll sell something of yours." The laughter stopped. Not gradually. Mold at once, the way out a room goes quiet when something unexpected has arrived. 200 people held that sentence in the air between them, turning it over, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Dale Richmond's smile did not disappear, but it changed. Something moved behind his eyes, something that was not amusement and was not quite anger and was not quite respect. Something that was all three of those things at once, pressed together into an expression Jenny would see in her memory for the next 8 years, every time she felt like giving up. She stepped away from the microphone. The talent competition moved on to a boy from the north end of the county who could play the fiddle. The applause for him was enthusiastic and generous, and completely unlike the scattered, uncomfortable clapping that had followed Jenny off the stage. But Dale Richmond did not applaud the fiddle player. He was still watching the spot where Jenny had stood. Now let me tell you who Jenny Caldwell was before that August afternoon, because the bravery of what she did at that microphone only makes sense if you understand what she was carrying when she walked up to it. Thomas and Jenny Caldwell were farming people going back 4 generations in Nebraska. The land they worked, 160 acres on the eastern edge of Madison County, was not rich land. It was decent land. It produced what it was asked to produce, and no more. And in good years, that was enough. And in bad years, it required everything the family had, including sleep and savings, and the kind of optimism that only people who work the earth fully understand. Everett Caldwell. Jenny's father was a quiet man in the way that certain landscapes produce quiet men. The open plains of northeastern Nebraska do not reward unnecessary noise. The wind takes everything you say and scatters it before it can arrive anywhere. Everett had learned early that actions carried farther than words, and he had built his life accordingly. He worked from before sunrise to after dark, maintained his equipment with religious care, paid his debts on time, and treated everyone on his land with the same straightforward decency, whether they were hired hands or county commissioners. He was not a man of many words, but the words he chose were always exactly right. Loretta Caldwell was different. She was the one who filled the house with sound, who sang while she cooked, who could hold a conversation with a fence post and make the fence post feel heard. She was the one who noticed things, who remembered birthdays and kept track of who was struggling, and showed up with a casserole before anyone had to ask for help. She was also the one who noticed first, when Jenny was 4 years old, that her daughter's words were coming out wrong. Not wrong in content. Jenny always knew exactly what she wanted to say. Wrong in delivery. The sounds would catch somewhere between thought and voice, jamming against each other, like freight cars on a bad track. Sometimes she could push through them with effort. Sometimes the effort made it worse. And sometimes the words simply would not come at all, no matter how desperately she needed them. The doctor said it happened sometimes. Children develop stutters, and nobody could say exactly why. Most of them grew out of it. Jenny did not grow out of it. School was its own particular kind of education, not in mathematics or reading or the history of the Republic, but in the precise geography of humiliation. Jenny learned exactly which teachers would call on her anyway, and which ones had enough mercy to pretend she didn't exist. She learned which hallways were safe and which ones contained the boys who would follow her, asking questions just to watch her struggle to answer. She learned to arrive early to every class so she could choose a seat near the wall where she could see everything and be responsible for as little speaking as possible. She became a watcher. This is important. This is the thing that Dale Richmond and everyone who laughed at that county fair microphone did not understand and could not have understood even if they had tried. Jenny Caldwell, who could barely speak, had developed the ability to read people the way other people read books. She watched faces the way a musician watches sheet music, interpreting every flicker and shift and tightening as information. She could tell when someone was about to change their mind. She could tell when a person said yes and meant no, when laughter covered anger, when stillness covered grief. She could hold an entire room in her peripheral vision and process everything happening in it simultaneously. She had learned to do this because she had no other choice. When you cannot speak, you must see. But there was one place, one single place in Jenny Caldwell's life where none of this careful watching and strategic silence was necessary. The auction yard. Everett had started taking her to livestock auctions when she was 6 years old. She would sit in the wooden bleachers next to him smelling of hay and tractor grease and the particular warmth of a man who has been working outdoors since before dawn, and she would watch the auctioneers work. She did not know what to call what she felt watching them. She was 6 years old, and she did not yet have the vocabulary for it. But she felt it in her chest and her throat and the palms of her hands, this sensation of watching someone do something that was in the most fundamental sense impossible. A human voice moving faster than thought, words becoming music. The crowd responding not to meaning, but to rhythm, to the hypnotic pull of a chant that turned commerce into something closer to ceremony. The auctioneers did not speak the way people spoke. They did not speak the way the teachers spoke when they called on Jenny and watched her struggle. They did not speak the way the boys in the hallways spoke when they wanted to watch her fail. They moved through language at a completely different speed, in a completely different register, following a pattern that was as structured and as beautiful as anything Jenny had ever heard. And one afternoon, sitting in the bleachers next to her father at a livestock sale outside of Norfolk, 8 years old, and small enough to see the whole room from between the shoulders of the men in front of her, Jenny opened her mouth and tried to follow along. 5, now 10, $10 bid, now 15, 15, give me 15. The words came out smooth. She said it again under her breath, barely audible, a private experiment conducted in the middle of a crowd. The rhythm pulled the words forward. There was no catching, no jamming, no pileup of sounds behind her teeth. The words just came, one after another, carried on the rhythm, the way a leaf is carried on a current. She tried it in her bedroom that night, and the night after, and every night for the next 9 years. Not perfectly, not always. There were nights when the stutter broke through, even the rhythm, when exhaustion or emotion overwhelmed the pattern she had built. But most nights in the privacy of her room, Jenny Caldwell could chant like an auctioneer, smooth and fast and clean, the words flowing the way water flows when it finds its proper channel. She told no one, not her mother, not her father, not any of the few friends she had managed to hold on to through the careful management of her silence. This was hers. This discovery she had made alone in her room was the most valuable thing she owned, more valuable than anything on the farm, and she held it close the way you hold a flame in the wind, cupped in both hands, terrified that showing it to anyone will blow it out. Until the county fair, until Dale Richmond's voice and that single word, sweetie, that had lit something in her that turned out to be less like a flame and more like a furnace. She drove home from the fair with her parents in a silence that was different from her usual silence. Everett kept his eyes on the road. Loretta looked out the passenger window at the flat Nebraska landscape unreeling itself in the last light of afternoon. Nobody said anything about what had happened. In the Caldwell family, the things that mattered most were often the things that took the longest to approach. Jenny went to her room when they got home. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the wall and did not cry. She was done crying about things like this. She had cried in 6th grade when Michael Bassett had imitated her stutter in front of the whole cafeteria, and she had cried in 9th grade when the speech therapist at the school had told her mother in a voice that wasn't quite quiet enough that some children simply never fully recover. She had cried enough to understand that crying did not change anything, and she had decided somewhere around age 14 to stop spending herself on things that didn't change anything. She sat there and she thought about Dale Richmond's face. Not the laughter, not the word sweetie, the thing that came after. The thing that had moved behind his eyes when she leaned into the microphone and said what she said, that flicker of something that was not quite what she had expected. She had expected him to laugh harder. She had braced for it. He hadn't. She was still thinking about that when she heard the knock at her door. "Come in," she managed, the words arriving without too much difficulty in the quiet of her room. Everett Caldwell opened the door and stood in the frame. He was still in his work clothes, which meant he had not changed since the fair, which was unusual. He was not a man who sat in discomfort longer than necessary. He looked at his daughter for a moment. "You still want it?" he asked. Simple as that. No preamble, no softening. Jenny met his eyes. She knew what it was. She had only said it in public once in front of 200 people. But between herself and her father, it had always been understood the way certain things are understood in families that don't talk much. "Yes, sir," she said. "I want to be an auctioneer." Everett nodded once slowly in that particular way he had of confirming that a decision had been received and filed and would now be acted upon. "There's a school in Kansas City," he said, "Missouri Auction School. 3 weeks. Teaches you everything there is to know." Jenny knew the number before he said it. She had looked it up herself 2 years earlier in a moment of either optimism or masochism. She had found the brochure in the county extension office and memorized every line of it, including the cost. $400, she said. Everett looked at her steadily. $400 was the repair they had been putting off on the tractor since spring. $400 was Christmas and 3 months of birthday gifts and the new boots Loretta needed before winter. $400 was not money the Caldwells had sitting still somewhere, waiting to be spent. Dad, Jenny started the word catching slightly on her teeth. "We can't. Let me worry about what we can afford," Everett said. He said it without self-pity and without drama, which was the only way Everett Caldwell ever said anything that mattered. Then he said, "You stood in front of half this county today and told Dale Richmond you'd sell something of his someday." He paused. A rare smile moved across the weathered terrain of his face. "That took more courage than most men I know have ever shown." "You think I'm not going to back that up?" Jenny could not speak. Not because of the stutter, because of something that had nothing to do with the machinery of speech and everything to do with the machinery of the heart. She looked at her father standing in the doorway, still in his work clothes, smelling of the fair and the truck and the long Nebraska summer, and she understood something she had not fully understood before. He believed in her. Not in spite of the stutter, not as an act of fatherly charity. He believed in her the way you believe in something you have been watching quietly for a long time and are not the least bit surprised by. 2 weeks later, on a Monday morning in early September, Jenny Caldwell boarded a Greyhound bus outside Norfolk with $400 of her family's money in her coat pocket and a bag packed for 3 weeks and more fear in her chest than she had ever carried in her life. She was 17 years old. She was going to Kansas City to become an auctioneer. She did not look back when the bus pulled away from the station. She already knew what was behind her. The Missouri Auction School occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse 2 blocks from the stockyards in Kansas City. It smelled of old wood and leather and the particular brand of anxiety that collects in rooms where people are trying to learn something that doesn't come naturally. There were 30 students in Jenny's class, 29 men and 1 girl. She knew before she walked through the door that this would be the case. She had known since she found the brochure in the extension office 2 years ago. She had known it the way she knew most things about her own life, not as a surprise, but as a condition, something to be accounted for and managed, and not permitted to become an obstacle. The men ranged in age from early 20s to mid-50s, farmers mostly looking for a way to supplement income during slow seasons. A few businessmen who had gotten ideas. One retired postal worker who said he'd always loved the sound of it. They were, with a handful of exceptions, decent men, and most of them were kind to Jenny in the imprecise, slightly awkward way that men of that generation were kind to women who showed up in places women weren't expected to show up. The instructor's name was Roy Barker. He was 60 years old and built like a fireplace, square and solid, and radiating a warmth that was entirely professional. He had been calling auctions since 1938 and teaching since 1965, and he had the voice of a man who had spent 4 decades using it as a precision instrument. He could fill a room without a microphone. He could drop to a near whisper that somehow still reached the back wall. On the first day, he stood at the front of the room and looked at his 30 students with the calm, appraising eye of someone who had seen every type and was no longer surprised by any of them. "Each of you is going to stand at this podium today," he said. "No preparation, no warm-up. You're just going to show me what you've got." One by one, the students shuffled to the front of the room and did their best, which ranged from surprisingly competent to painfully awkward. Some had clearly been practicing. Some had clearly never considered that practice might be necessary. Roy watched all of them with the same steady, unreadable expression, occasionally making notes on a clipboard, never indicating whether what he was hearing was good or terrible. Jenny was the last to go. She had been sitting in the back row watching every student who went before her, filing away information, cataloging what worked and what didn't, building a picture of the room that she would use in ways she couldn't yet articulate. This was what she did. This was what years of watching instead of speaking had made her very good at. She walked to the podium. The room changed when she got there. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift in the quality of attention, the particular alertness that arrives when something unexpected is about to happen. 29 men and Roy Barker looked at this 17-year-old girl standing at the podium of a Kansas City auction school with her hands on the sides of the lectern and her jaw set and her eyes straight ahead. Roy said, "Go ahead, show me what you've got." Jenny opened her mouth. The block arrived before the first sound did. The wall in her throat, the pileup behind her teeth, the silence stretching into 3 seconds, then 4, then 5. She heard someone shift in a chair. She heard a small sound from somewhere near the middle of the room that might have been the beginning of a whisper. She closed her eyes. She stopped trying to talk. She thought about the livestock auction outside Norfolk when she was 8 years old. She thought about the bleachers and the smell of hay and her father's shoulder next to hers. She thought about the rhythm she had been building in secret for 9 years in her bedroom in the barn. In every quiet moment she had managed to carve out of a life that didn't offer many. And she began to chant. 5. Now 10. $10 bid. Now 15. 15. Give me 15. $15 bid. Now 20. 20. Now 25. It was not fast. It was not polished. It did not have the machine gun precision that the best auctioneers achieve after years of daily practice. But it was fluid. It was connected. The words moved from one to the next without catching, without jamming, without the terrible hesitation that defined her in every other context. When she stopped, the room was completely silent. Roy Barker stepped forward from where he had been standing against the far wall. He walked slowly to the front of the room, looking at Jenny the way a doctor looks at a patient when something unexpected shows up in the results. "How long have you been stuttering?" he asked. "All my life," she said. The words arrived without too much difficulty in the quiet after the chant. "But you don't stutter when you chant." "No, sir. Not usually." Roy was quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it was. In 23 years of teaching this craft, he said, "Finally, I have never seen that happen. Most people under pressure, their problems get worse. Whatever door you were standing in front of you found a way around the wall." He turned to face the rest of the class. "Pay attention to this," he said, "because what you just watched is not luck. It is not a trick. What you just watched is what happens when someone wants something badly enough that they find a way through every obstacle between them and it, including the ones inside their own head." He turned back to Jenny. "The stutter isn't going away," he said. "I want you to understand that. This isn't a cure, but what you've discovered is real and it works, and I have never seen anyone your age or any age who needed this the way you need this, which means I have never seen anyone your age or any age who is going to work as hard to get it." He was right on all counts. Jenny Caldwell was the worst student in the class for the first week. She was average in the second week. On graduation day at the end of the third week, she was not the best in the class, but she was not the worst either. She was something more important than either of those things. She was someone who had a certificate in her hand, a rhythm in her chest, and a name to go back to Madison County and prove wrong. She boarded the bus home with the certificate in her coat pocket next to the few dollars she had managed not to spend on food, and she watched the Missouri landscape give way to Nebraska through the smudged window, and she practiced her chant under her breath so quietly that the man asleep in the next seat never stirred. 5. Now 10. $10 bid. Now 15. 15. Give me 15. She came home to Madison County on a Thursday afternoon in late October, and the county had not changed while she was gone, which was exactly what she expected and exactly what she was afraid of. The Caldwell farm looked the same. The sky looked the same. The gravel roads and the grain elevators and the Lutheran church with the cracked parking lot all looked exactly the same. And Jenny stood in front of her childhood home with her bag in her hand and her certificate in her pocket and felt the weight of sameness pressing down on everything she had just built. Dale Richmond had not gone anywhere either. He had not gone anywhere, and he had not forgotten anything, and the 2 months since the county fair had apparently given him time to decide exactly what he intended to do about the problem of Jenny Caldwell. Her first auction job came through a man named Harlan Chester, who ran a small auction operation out of Norfolk and had heard about Jenny's school certificate through the county grapevine. He was cautious but fair-minded, the kind of man who believed in giving people a chance before he made up his mind about them. He offered Jenny a small estate sale and older widow's household goods. Nothing complicated, just a chance to show what she could do in front of a real crowd. Jenny said yes before he finished the sentence. She spent the next 2 weeks preparing. She drove the route to the sale location 3 times. She cataloged every item in the estate until she knew its estimated value. She practiced her chant every morning and every evening, timing herself, pushing the speed incrementally upward, building the rhythm into her muscle memory until it lived in a place below conscious thought. 2 days before the auction, the phone rang. It was Harlan Chester. His voice was different from when he'd called before. Heavier. The voice of a man who had something to say that he didn't want to say. "I'm sorry, Jenny, I can't use you." She stood very still. "Why Dale Richmond came to my office yesterday afternoon," Harlan said. "He told me that if I let a girl run one of my auctions, particularly you specifically, he would pull every piece of business he's ever given me. And he'd make sure everyone in his circle knew why." Jenny said nothing. "I'm sorry," Harlan said again. He meant it. She could hear that he meant it. That somehow made it worse. "He's got the whole county in his pocket, Jenny. I can't afford to cross him. Not with my margins." The phone went back to its cradle. Jenny stood in the kitchen of her parents' house and looked at the wall for a long time. The certificate was in her room. The rhythm was in her chest. And Dale Richmond was everywhere else. She stood there, and she thought about his face at the county fair, the way his smile had changed when she spoke, the flicker behind his eyes that was not quite what she expected. He had felt something in that moment. She didn't know yet what to do with that, but she filed it away in the same precise internal archive, where she filed everything she observed, and she turned away from the wall and she went to find her father, because there was still a next step, and she intended to find it. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to people who are fighting a battle nobody else can see. Not the loneliness of being alone in a room, not the loneliness of grief or heartbreak, which at least announces itself clearly and earns a certain amount of acknowledgement from the world around it. This is the loneliness of waking up every morning and picking up a fight that has no witnesses, no scoreboard, and no guaranteed ending. The loneliness of knowing exactly what you are capable of and having no arena in which to prove it. Jenny Caldwell lived inside that loneliness for the better part of 3 years. She did not waste time feeling sorry for herself. That was not how she was built. And even if it had been, she had watched her father work a 160-acre farm through droughts and debt, and years when the prices dropped below what it cost to grow the crop, and Everett Caldwell had never once sat down in the middle of it to grieve the unfairness of weather. You worked with what the sky gave you. When the sky gave you nothing, you worked with what was left. What Jenny had left after Harlan Chester's phone call and the closed door of her first real job was the rhythm, the certificate, and a name she had heard once spoken by Harlan himself in the brief conversation before everything fell apart. Hank Sutton. "He's the best there ever was in this part of Nebraska," Harlan had said almost as an aside, almost as if the information were not going to matter. "Retired now. Had a stroke a few years back. Lives out on the edge of town." Jenny drove to Hank Sutton's house on a Wednesday morning in November, with frost still white on the fields and a sky the color of old pewter pressing down on everything. The house was small and carefully maintained, the kind of house that belonged to a man who had decided that whatever space remained to him would be kept in order. She knocked on the door and waited, and when it opened, she found herself looking at a man who seemed at first to be made entirely of angles. Sharp cheekbones, sharp eyes, a jaw that had kept its definition through age and illness. His right hand hung at his side with the particular stillness of a limb that had been partially reclaimed by a body that was no longer fully cooperating. His left hand held the door with complete steadiness. He looked at her for a long moment. "I know who you are," he said. His voice was still remarkable. Even diminished, even without the platform and the crowd and the years of active use it carried in the cold morning air, with effortless authority. Hank Sutton's voice was the voice of a man who had spent decades making himself heard in large spaces, and it remembered that even if the rest of him had begun to forget. "Jenny Caldwell," she said. The words came out cleanly in the cold air, which sometimes helped. "I know," he said again. Dale Richmond's been talking about you. She waited. She had learned in 17 years of choosing her words carefully that waiting was often more informative than asking. Come inside, Hank said. I want to hear you chant. She stood in his living room, surrounded by stacks of auction catalogs going back decades, and framed photographs of livestock sales and equipment auctions, and crowds of men in work clothes squinting against sun and dust. And she chanted for an hour while Hank Sutton sat in his armchair, with his eyes closed and his head tilted slightly to one side like a man listening to music he has not heard in a long time. He stopped her occasionally. Again, slower on the transition. Where is your breath coming from? When she finished, he was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Did a woman ever make it in this business? Jenny asked. She had not planned to ask it. It arrived without preparation, the question she had been carrying since she was 8 years old in the bleachers, since the first time she understood that every single person she had ever watched at an auction podium was a man. Hank opened his eyes. Not yet, he said. He held her gaze without flinching, because he was a man who believed in the value of honest answers even when they were difficult. Then he said, but you might be the first. He paused. If you've got the spine for what's coming. She looked at him steadily. What's coming, he told her. Not everything, not the specifics that he couldn't yet know, but the shape of it. Dale Richmond's influence, which extended further and deeper than most people understood. The phone calls already made, the favors already called in, the quiet, systematic pressure being applied to every auction house and estate sale operation within 100 miles of Madison County. Hank had heard things through channels that stayed open even after a man retired, because the relationships built over 50 years of calling, auctions do not close when a career does. He's not trying to slow you down, Hank said. He's trying to make sure you never start. Jenny absorbed this the way she absorbed most hard information without visible reaction, filing it in the internal archive where it would become useful eventually. Then he said the thing she had not come to hear and had not expected. Dale Richmond came to see me 15 years ago, Hank said. My daughter was a lawyer in Lincoln, young, talented, working her way up in a firm there. Dale had business interests that crossed paths with one of her cases. He didn't threaten her directly. He never did anything directly. He just started talking to people, mentioning things, suggesting that she was difficult to work with, that her judgment was questionable, that her personal life was complicated in ways that made her unreliable. He stopped. Something moved across his face, something old and unresolved. Within 18 months, she had lost her position at the firm. She moved to Colorado. She rebuilt eventually, but she never came back to Nebraska. Dale Richmond cost her 5 years of the career she had built, and the place she had always thought of as home. The room was very quiet. I couldn't protect her, Hank said. I didn't understand what was happening until it was already done. He looked at Jenny with eyes that had seen enough of the world to know exactly what they were looking at. I can't undo that, but I can teach you how to be untouchable. Jenny looked at this old man in his armchair with his paralyzed hand and his catalog stacks, and his voice that still carried like a bell in cold air, and she felt something move in her that was not pity and was not gratitude exactly, but was something in the neighborhood of both. I don't need the story, she said. I just need the knowledge. Hank Sutton almost smiled. Good, he said. Then we won't waste any more time. He took her on as an apprentice that November, and for the next 3 years, Jenny Caldwell received an education that no auction school had ever offered, and no certification could ever fully capture. Hank taught her to read a crowd the way she already read faces, but with greater precision and at greater speed. He taught her that every auction has a rhythm of its own, independent of the chant, a larger rhythm of momentum and hesitation and competitive instinct that a skilled auctioneer can feel through the floor of the podium and shape with small adjustments of pace and emphasis. He taught her when to slow down so that urgency could build in the crowd rather than in her own voice. He taught her when to push, when to hold, when to let silence do the work that words could not. He taught her things that had no names, the almost imperceptible shoulder movement that meant a bidder was about to drop out. The particular quality of attention in a man's face when he wanted something badly enough that pride was going to cost him money. The way a crowd's collective hesitation could be broken with a single perfectly timed redirect. She absorbed it all. She had been watching people carefully for her entire life. What Hank gave her was a framework For everything she had already observed a vocabulary for the fluency she had been developing in secret since she was 6 years old in the bleachers outside Norfolk. In exchange, she handled everything else. The paperwork, the logistics, the equipment, the phone calls, the unglamorous administrative machinery that kept an auction business running. She did it without complaint because she understood that this was part of the apprenticeship, that the work behind the podium was inseparable from the work at it. And through all of it, the war with Dale Richmond continued. It was not a dramatic war. There were no confrontations, no shouted accusations, no moments that would play well in a story about heroes and villains. It was a quiet war conducted entirely through intermediaries and implications, and it was devastating in the ordinary way that sustained pressure is devastating not all at once, but incrementally wearing down possibility, the way water wears down stone. Dale made phone calls. Dale had conversations at his grain elevator and at his bank and at the co-op meetings where half the county gathered to talk about prices and weather and the shared concerns of people whose livelihoods were rooted in the same soil. He did not say anything that could be directly refuted. He raised questions. He mentioned concerns. He suggested, gently and repeatedly, that putting a stuttering girl at an auction podium was not a business decision that a serious operation would make. Some people listened. Some people decided that their relationship with Dale Richmond was worth more than the chance they might have given Jenny Caldwell. She did not blame them. She understood the calculus. Dale Richmond had real power, and real power meant real consequences, and the people of Madison County were not wealthy enough to absorb consequences lightly. But not everyone listened. There were people in the county and the counties surrounding it who had a different kind of history with Hank Sutton, a history built not on power or debt or threat, but on something older and more durable. A fair deal during a hard year. A word of support when the banks were saying no. A hand extended without expectation of return. Hank had been building that history for 50 years. Dale Richmond could not make phone calls fast enough to erase 50 years. And so Jenny drove. She drove hundreds of miles on roads that were sometimes paved and sometimes not to auction jobs in small towns in the next county, and the county after that, places where Dale Richmond's voice had not yet reached or had reached, but had not found purchase. She called estate sales and livestock auctions and the occasional equipment sale for farms that were downsizing or consolidating. She called them for fees that sometimes barely covered the gas and sometimes did not cover it at all. She did not stop, and she got better. This is the part of the story that is hard to convey, the part that happens in the unglamorous middle between the dramatic beginning and the dramatic ending, the long, quiet stretch where the work is done and the progress is real, but invisible from the outside. Jenny Caldwell got better in the way that serious practitioners get better incrementally and invisibly, each small improvement building on the last, until one day the person who had been average was no longer average and had not noticed exactly when that changed. The stutter was still there. It would always be there. In the grocery store and at the gas station and in every ordinary conversation of her daily life, the words still caught, sometimes still piled up, still required the patient effort of someone navigating a road with regular obstacles. She had made her peace with this the way you make peace with a permanent feature of a landscape. You don't pretend it isn't there. You learn the most efficient routes around it. But behind the microphone and the rhythm, she was becoming something else entirely. Then came Ruth Hannigan. Ruth Hannigan was 63 years old, a widow of 4 years, and the owner of a 200-acre farm on the western edge of the county that she had been running alone since her husband Leonard died of a heart attack in the middle of the spring planting season in 1971. She was small and precise and possessed of a stubbornness that the county had long since stopped trying to overcome. She was also in a quiet and indirect way in financial trouble. Leonard had borrowed from Dale Richmond's bank during an expansion phase in 1969, and the loan had terms that had seemed reasonable in the context of rising land prices and optimistic forecasts in the general sense prevalent throughout the agricultural Midwest in those years, that the good times were a permanent condition rather than a cycle. The good times had not proven permanent. Ruth was current on her payments barely, but the relationship meant that Dale Richmond had a lever, and Dale Richmond was not above using a lever. When Ruth Hannigan decided she needed to liquidate some equipment and a parcel of the back 40 to free up operating capital, she called the 3 largest auction operations in the county. All three told her in various carefully worded ways that their schedules were unfortunately full. She found Jenny Caldwell's name on a flyer that someone had tacked to the bulletin board at the feed store. She called the number on a Tuesday evening and spoke to Jenny directly and said without preamble, "I hear Dale Richmond doesn't want anyone hiring you." She paused. "I've been letting Dale Richmond's opinions affect my decisions for 4 years, and it has not improved my situation. Can you do this job?" "Yes, ma'am," Jenny said. The words came out clean and certain. "Then come by Thursday and we'll talk." The auction was on a Saturday in early October 1977, and by 9 in the morning there were more people in Ruth Hannigan's equipment yard than Jenny had expected. Word had gotten out the way word always gets out in small communities, and some of the people who showed up had come to buy equipment, and some had come to watch something they had heard about and were not sure they believed. Jenny stepped up to the temporary podium Ruth had arranged from a plywood sheet and two sawhorses, and she adjusted the handheld microphone and she looked out at the crowd. There were men in the crowd who had laughed at the county fair 3 years ago. She recognized some of their faces. She filed the recognition away and did not let it reach her expression. She began to chant. What happened in the next 4 hours was not magic. It was the result of 3 years of daily practice and 50 years of accumulated knowledge transmitted from a man in an armchair to a girl willing to receive it. It was Hank's framework applied to Jenny's natural ability to read a room. It was the rhythm she had been building since she was 8 years old, finally operating in full view of the world rather than in the privacy of her bedroom. The equipment sold for 40% above the estimated value. 40%. Ruth Hannigan stood next to Jenny when it was over, looking at the numbers the Federal Land Bank representative had written on a clipboard, and she said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "I want you to know that I am going to tell everyone I know what happened here today." And she did. You cannot erase a number. Dale Richmond could make phone calls. He could raise questions and plant doubts and lean on relationships and call in favors. But he could not reach inside Ruth Hannigan's accounting ledger and remove the 40%. The number existed. People talked about it. And in communities where margins are thin and prices are everything, a 40% improvement is not a rumor that stays quiet. Jenny drove home from the Hannigan auction as the sun was setting over the flat western horizon, turning the sky the deep orange of a thing that has been heated past what it was designed to hold, and she felt for the first time since she had stepped off the Greyhound bus from Kansas City something that was not hope, which is too fragile a thing, but something more like certainty. The quiet, solid knowledge that the road she was on was the right one, regardless of who was trying to close it. Hank Sutton's health declined through 1977 and into 1978, in the way that health declines after a serious stroke, not in a straight line, but in a series of plateaus and drops, each plateau slightly lower than the one before, each drop arriving without warning. There were weeks when he seemed almost himself, when his voice filled the room and his eyes were sharp, and he could talk about auction strategy for hours without losing the thread. There were other weeks when Jenny arrived to find him in his chair looking at the catalog stacks with the distant expression of a man whose thoughts had traveled somewhere his body could no longer follow. He kept teaching through all of it. He taught her until the information had no more room to live anywhere but inside her. In September of 1978, he called his last auction, the Henderson estate sale. 400 acres going to liquidation, full equipment, line everything. It was the largest auction anyone in Madison County had seen in a decade, and half the county showed up, drawn partly by the scale of the sale and partly by the knowledge that Hank Sutton was behind the microphone one final time. He was magnificent. Jenny stood off to the side and watched him work, and she thought about the first time she had sat in the bleachers at a livestock auction and felt the rhythm pull something open inside her chest, and she understood now what she had been feeling then. She had been watching mastery, the real thing, the thing that takes a lifetime to build and looks effortless from the outside and is anything but. Hank called 4 hours of bidding without significant pause, and every lot sold at or above estimate, and at the end, he stood at the microphone one final time and looked out at the crowd with the particular look of a man who knows something is ending and has decided to meet it with his eyes open. He announced his retirement. He announced that Sutton Auction Services would continue under new management. He said Jenny Caldwell's name. The murmur that moved through the crowd was complex. Jenny heard everything in it. The surprise, the doubt, the recognition from some faces that had been at the Hannigan auction, the harder skepticism from faces that had not. She heard the history of the last 4 years compressed into 30 seconds of crowd noise. Dale Richmond was standing near the back. She had not seen him arrive. She saw him now in the particular way she saw everything, with the peripheral precision that had been her greatest tool since childhood. He was not laughing. He stood very still among the shifting, murmuring crowd, and he watched Hank Sutton at the microphone, and then he looked at Jenny, and his face held an expression she could not entirely read. He spoke before the crowd had fully settled. His voice carried the way it always carried, as if volume were a form of authority and authority were a form of right. A stuttering woman running auctions, he said. He said it loudly enough to be heard, but not loudly enough to be called a speech. The kind of statement that could be walked back as an aside if necessary. Hank Sutton has lost his mind. Laughter moved through the parts of the crowd that were still open to it. Jenny looked at Dale Richmond across the distance of the auction yard and said nothing. Hank finished his remarks. The crowd began to disperse. Jenny helped with the breakdown of equipment, the paperwork, the end-of-day accounting, all the work that follows the visible work. When everything was loaded and settled, she drove Hank home and helped him to his chair. He looked more tired than she had ever seen him. Not the tiredness of one long day, but of a body that had used its last major reserves for something it considered worth the cost. She was gathering her things to leave when she stopped. On the corner of Hank's desk, under a coffee cup that served as a paperweight, was an envelope. The return address was a law office in Norfolk. The date on the postmark was 2 months old. She should not have looked closer. She knew she should not have. She looked closer. It was a letter, formal, legal in its phrasing, setting out the terms of an offer to purchase Sutton Auction Services. The offer was substantial, more than twice what the business was worth by any reasonable valuation. The kind of offer that is made not because the buyer wants the asset, but because the buyer wants to ensure that someone else does not have it. The buyer was listed as a holding company, but the holding company's registered agent was Dale Richmond's attorney. At the bottom of the letter, in Hank's careful, slightly unsteady handwriting, declined. One word. No explanation. No counteroffer. Just the single flat refusal of a man who understood exactly what was being purchased and what it would post, and who had decided that some things were not for sale regardless of the number attached. Jenny stood in Hank Sutton's living room with that letter in her hand and felt something move through her that was large and quiet and without easy name. He had turned down more money than she would earn in the next 10 years. He had turned it down without telling her, without making it a thing between them, without asking for acknowledgement or gratitude. He had just decided. She set the letter back under the coffee cup exactly as she had found it. She did not tell him what she had seen. She did not need to. Hank Sutton died on a Thursday morning in January of 1979, with Jenny sitting in the chair next to his bed, and the catalog stacks visible through the open door of the living room, and the Nebraska winter pressing white and silent against every window. His voice at the end was not what it had been. Illness had reduced it to something smaller, something that required leaning close to hear. But it was still his voice, still carried the quality of a man who had spent his life making himself heard. "Don't let them decide who you are," he said. Jenny held his hand, the good one, the one that had kept its strength. She wanted to say something. She wanted to tell him about the letter. She wanted to tell him that she understood what he had done and what it had cost, and that she was not going to waste it. But the words caught the way they always caught, when she needed them most, when the emotion was too large for the machinery to handle. She didn't say anything. She thought he understood anyway. He died as the morning light came through the east-facing window, pale and horizontal, and without warmth, the particular light of a Nebraska January that makes no promises about anything. Jenny drove home on roads that were empty in the early morning and let the silence of the truck cab hold everything she could not yet put into language. The day will come, Hank had told her once, when everything depends on your voice. When you are exhausted, when you are emotional, when the whole world is watching. And on that day, the rhythm has to be so deep in your bones that nothing can shake it loose. She had believed him then. She believed him more completely now. The years between Hank's death and the spring of 1982 were the years when Jenny Caldwell became, quietly and without fanfare, the best auctioneer in the region. Not because people felt sorry for her. That sympathy had worn itself out long before. not because Hank's endorsement had opened every door. Dale Richmond had continued his quiet war, continued his phone calls and his implications, and the careful application of pressure to anyone who might otherwise have given Jenny more than a small chance. She built her reputation the only way available to her. One auction at a time, one lot at a time, one bid coaxed out of a hesitant buyer at a time with the rhythm and the crowd reading and the thousand small adjustments she had been training for since she was 8 years old. The stutter was still there. It would always be there. But behind the microphone and the rhythm, the stuttering girl from the county fair had become something that even Dale Richmond's most loyal allies could no longer dismiss because the numbers did not lie and could not be argued with, and Jenny Caldwell's numbers were better than anyone else's in 100 miles. Dale Richmond was still the most powerful man in Madison County, but the agricultural economy of the American Midwest was about to change the meaning of that power in ways that no one, including Dale Richmond, had anticipated. The boom years of the 1970s had encouraged borrowing on a scale that made sense when land values were rising and grain prices were strong, and the future looked like more of the same. Dale had expanded aggressively through that decade. More land, more equipment, more grain storage, more debt always financed through his own bank on terms that reflected his confidence in his own judgment. By 1981, interest rates had reached levels that made those debts into a different kind of animal entirely. Land values had dropped, grain prices had followed, and the obligations that Dale Richmond had taken on in the optimism of the previous decade sat on his balance sheet like something that could not be moved and could not be ignored and was becoming, with each passing month, harder to survive. Jenny did not know any of this yet. She was somewhere in the neighboring county, calling a livestock sale, watching the crowd, reading faces, pushing bids higher, with the precision instrument of a voice and a rhythm built from 25 years of quiet, determined work. She did not know that the phone call was coming, but somewhere in the back of her chest, in the place where the rhythm lived, something was waiting. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 1982. Jenny was at the kitchen table going over paperwork from a livestock sale she had called the previous weekend, the kind of administrative work that followed every auction, the way a shadow follows a person invisible during the performance and unavoidable afterward. The numbers on the page were good. They were better than good. The consignors had shaken her hand with the particular warmth of people whose expectations have been exceeded, and that warmth was the thing Jenny had learned to measure her progress by more reliably than any other metric. The phone rang. The man on the other end introduced himself as Sterling Vance, Federal Land Bank Omaha office. His voice was careful and professional, the voice of a man who had learned to deliver complicated news without inflection so that the recipient had to find their own way to its meaning. He told her what was happening. Dale Richmond's foreclosure proceedings had been finalized. The Federal Land Bank held the primary liens on the majority of his holdings. A liquidation auction was being scheduled for mid-May. The complete operation, all 2,000 acres, the full equipment line, the grain storage structures, the livestock, everything that Dale Richmond had built over 3 decades, and everything his father had built before him. "We've approached 2 other auctioneers," Sterling Vance said. Both declined. Jenny said nothing. She was listening to the spaces between what he was saying. "Mr. Richmond has been making calls," Sterling continued, suggesting that working this auction would carry professional consequences. "Our research, however, indicates that you are the most experienced auctioneer in the region, with the strongest record for sale prices." He paused. "Given your history with Mr. Richmond, we thought you might be willing to consider it." The kitchen was very quiet. Through the window above the sink, Jenny could see the Caldwell fields still brown from winter, waiting for the season to tell them what to do next. 8 years. 8 years since the county fair tent and the folding chairs and Dale Richmond's voice rising above the laughter. 8 years since she had leaned into a microphone on unsteady legs and said words that the whole county had heard and most of them had not believed. "Someday I'll sell something of yours." She had believed it when she said it. She had believed it the way you believe something that lives in the part of you that exists below. Reason, below calculation, below the part that accounts for probability and opposition, and the accumulated weight of everything that stands between a 17-year-old girl and the thing she has decided to become. Now the day was here and she felt none of the triumph she might have expected. "I'll be there," she said. The words arrived without a single catch, clean and direct. But I want you to understand something before we go further. Sterling Vance waited. I'm going to run a fair auction, Jenny said. Whatever has happened between Dale Richmond and me is not going to touch the way I do this job. Every lot goes to the highest legitimate bid. Every buyer gets a fair shot. The prices will be whatever the market will bear, nothing more and nothing less. If that's what you're looking for, I'm your auctioneer. If you're looking for something else, you need to call someone else. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. That Sterling Vance said is exactly what we were hoping you'd say. The auction is scheduled for May 15th. Can you be there? She told him she would be there. She set the phone back in its cradle and sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. The paperwork from the livestock sale was still spread in front of her. The good numbers of a good week. The evidence of everything she had built in the years since Hank Sutton had handed her a framework and a refusal and gone quietly into a January morning. She thought about Hank. She thought about what he had said to her once in his living room with the catalog stacks around him and the winter light coming through the window at a low angle. The bill always comes due, it always does. The question is whether you'll be ready when it happens. She had been ready for 8 years. She just hadn't known what she was ready for. The morning of May 15th arrived the way important mornings always arrive, without ceremony, without any atmospheric acknowledgement of what they contain. The Nebraska sky was the same sky it had been the day before and would be the day after, wide and pale and indifferent to human occasion. Jenny woke at 4 in the morning. She did not set an alarm. She had not needed one. Her body had been awake in the careful, vigilant way of a person who has something large coming, a kind of cellular alertness that no amount of deliberate relaxation could fully quiet. She dressed methodically. Her best clothes, not the word best in the sense of formal or showy, but in the sense she had always applied to it. The dark vest and the white shirt she had worn to every significant auction since she had taken over Sutton Auction Services. The clothes she had come to think of as her working self made visible the external signal of the internal state she needed to occupy. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror. She looked at herself for a long moment, not with vanity and not with doubt, with the particular assessment of someone running a final check before something that cannot be restarted once it has begun. Then she chanted, softly, barely above a whisper, so that the words stayed in the small space between her face and the glass. 5. Now 10. $10 bid. Now 15. 15. Give me 15. The rhythm was there. It was so far inside her now that it existed below muscle memory, below the level of conscious technique, in a place that she imagined could not be reached by exhaustion or emotion, or the specific concentrated pressure of 200 people watching her stand at the podium of the man who had spent 8 years trying to prevent exactly this from happening. 25 years of practice had put it there. Nothing was going to shake it loose. She drove to the Richmond property as the sun was coming up behind her, flat and orange and enormous on the eastern horizon, the way the Nebraska sun rises when the sky has nothing to interrupt it for 50 miles in any direction. The auction was not scheduled to start until 10. She had learned from Hank, who had learned it in his own long apprenticeship, that you arrive early enough to know the ground before you have to stand on it. She turned off the county road onto the long gravel drive that led to the Richmond property and felt the scale of it settle over her the way a landscape settles when you have heard it described and then finally see it in person and discover that the description was accurate and somehow still insufficient. 2,000 acres. The equipment lined up in the yard stretched further than she could take in at a single look. Tractors and combines and planters and trucks, implements of every kind, the accumulated machinery of a farming operation that had at its peak employed 30 people and produced a quantity of grain that would have seemed abstract as a number if you hadn't seen the storage structures standing beside the main barn, enormous corrugated steel cylinders that caught the early morning light. She walked the yard alone in the quiet before anyone else arrived. She cataloged what was there, not just the inventory she already knew from the sale documents Sterling Vance had sent her. The condition of things, the way equipment sat when it had been maintained with care, and the way it sat when the maintaining had stopped. The subtle geography of the yard, where the sight lines were clear, and where the crowd would naturally cluster, and where she would need to position herself to be seen and heard from the maximum number of positions simultaneously. She was standing near the far end of the equipment line, making notes in the small notebook she carried to every auction. When she heard footsteps on the gravel behind her, she turned. Dale Richmond walked toward her across the yard of his own property with the particular gait of a man who has spent a lifetime moving through spaces as though they belonged to him, because they always had. He was thinner than the man she remembered from the county fair. The 8 years had taken something from the physical architecture of him, the sense of mass and gravity that had made his presence in a room feel like a weather event. His hair had gone fully gray. His posture, which had always been the posture of a man who expected the world to accommodate itself to him, had given a little, as if certain certainties had been removed from the structure that held it up. But his eyes were the same. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at her in the early morning light and said nothing for a moment. So he said finally, "The girl from the county fair." Jenny looked at him steadily. "Mr. Richmond?" He looked around at the equipment yard, at his barn complex, at the house behind it that was larger than any house in the county needed to be and had always been understood as a statement rather than a dwelling. "You must be enjoying this," he said. She had thought about this moment. Not obsessively, not in the way of someone who has been feeding a grievance for years. But she had thought about it the way you think about a thing that is coming, turning it over occasionally to understand its shape, preparing for the version of yourself you want to bring to it. "No, sir," she said. "I'm not enjoying this." He looked at her. "I never wanted to see anyone lose their farm," she said. "I wanted to do my job. That's all I ever wanted to do." Dale Richmond's face did something complicated. Not softening exactly, more like a rearrangement, the way a landscape rearranges after something beneath it has shifted. He looked at this woman he had spent 8 years trying to stop standing in his equipment yard with a notebook in her hand and the early morning light behind her, and something that might have been recognition moved across his face. "I spent years making sure you couldn't work in this county," he said. "I know. And you're here anyway." "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the equipment line, at the long row of machinery that represented 30 years of expansion and investment, and the particular kind of ambition that does not know how to stop adding. "You weren't supposed to make it," he said. The same words he had said at the county fair, differently weighted now, stripped of mockery, carrying something closer to a confession. Jenny met his eyes. "I know," she said, "but here we are." Neither of them said anything else. Dale Richmond turned and walked back toward the house. Jenny watched him go and then turned back to the equipment line and opened her notebook and kept working. There was a great deal still to catalog before 10 o'clock, and she had never been someone who confused a significant moment for a stopping point. By 9:30 they were arriving. Not in ones and twos, but in a continuous stream. Trucks pulling into the fields that had been designated for parking, men in work clothes climbing down from cabs and walking toward the equipment yard with the purposeful gait of people who have come to buy things. Word of the Richmond liquidation had traveled the way important agricultural news always travels in rural Nebraska, fast and thorough, and with a weight attached to it that ordinary news does not carry. By the time Jenny stepped up to the podium at 10 o'clock, there were more than 300 people in the yard. She recognized faces. She recognized buyers she had worked with at other auctions across the region. She recognized farmers she had grown up around. She recognized people who had been in the tent at the county fair in 1974, though she could not have said with certainty who had laughed and who had not, because she had stopped tracking that distinction somewhere around 1977, when she had decided that the past was only useful as fuel, not as navigation. Dale Richmond and his wife Margaret were in the front row. Margaret's face was composed in the specific way of a woman who has had time to prepare for a difficult thing and has prepared well. Dale sat beside her, his posture the deliberate posture of a man who has decided how he intends to be seen doing this. He was not going to look at his shoes. He was not going to hide. Whatever the morning required of him, he would sit in the front row and he would meet it directly. Jenny noticed this. She filed it in the archive. She adjusted the microphone. She looked out at 300 people and felt the particular quality of silence that precedes something significant, the way a crowd goes quiet when it understands that what it is about to witness matters. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "welcome to the Richmond Estate Auction. We have a great deal of ground to cover today, so let's get started." And then she began. What happened over the next 6 hours was the thing that Jenny Caldwell had been building toward for 25 years, though she had not known its specific shape until this morning. The chant moved through the yard like a current, not loud in the way of performance, not showy, not calling attention to itself, but relentless, steady, precise. The rhythm she had discovered as an 8-year-old in the bleachers outside Norfolk and practiced in secret for 9 years and then honed through a decade of daily professional use had arrived at a place that Hank Sutton, sitting in his armchair, with his eyes closed and his head tilted, would have recognized as the real thing. Not technique applied to natural ability. Natural ability and technique fused so completely that they had become a single thing with no seam between them. She read the crowd the way she read everything continuously and without apparent effort, the information arriving through channels that had been open and functioning since childhood. She saw when a buyer was pulling back and redirected before the momentum could break. She saw when competitive instinct was building between two bidders and gave it room to develop rather than interrupting it. She saw when attention was flagging in one section of the crowd and adjusted her position so that the energy shifted and refocused. The lots moved through the morning, equipment, livestock, outbuildings and their contents, the smaller parcels of land on the edges of the property. She watched Dale Richmond in the front row. Through all of it, not fixedly, not with the attention that would have been visible to anyone observing her, but with the peripheral precision that was her oldest skill. He sat very still. He watched each lot go. His face did not change in the ways that faces change when they are covering grief or shame, the micro-expressions of suppression. He watched with the directness of a man who had decided that watching was the only honest response available to him, and he was going to be honest even when it cost him. Margaret held his hand. She had been holding it since the auction started. 3 hours in Stuttering, Vance appeared at Jenny's elbow during a brief administrative pause between sections of the sale. He leaned close and said quietly that the morning numbers were tracking substantially above the projection, that the creditor obligations were going to be fully satisfied and there would be a remainder. Jenny nodded once and went back to the podium. A remainder meant that Dale Richmond would walk away from this with something in. Not much, not enough to start again in any meaningful way, not at 63 years old in the wreckage of an agricultural economy that had dismantled half the operations in the county, but something. The difference between nothing and something in a life that has been reduced to the question is not a small difference. She had not thought about this when she agreed to take the job. She had not calculated it or intended it. It was simply what happened when an auction was called with full professional integrity, when every lot was pushed to its true market value, and no thumb was placed on any scale in any direction. This was the job. This was what Hank Sutton had meant when he said the word untouchable. Not invulnerable, not above consequence, but clean, doing the work so cleanly that there was no surface on which a criticism could find purchase, no angle from which the work could be seen as anything other than what it was. The moment arrived in the early afternoon. The lot was 80 acres of bottomland on the southern edge of the Richmond property, good soil, better than average drainage, the kind of land that in an ordinary market year would have attracted serious interest from multiple buyers. Jenny had looked at the reserve carefully. She knew what it was worth. The bidding opened and moved forward for 30 seconds and then stopped. She had felt it coming a few minutes before it happened. A subtle change in the quality of attention from a section of the crowd toward the rear left a particular kind of deliberate stillness that she had learned to read as intentional restraint rather than ordinary disinterest. Men who had the means to bid and were choosing not to. She looked at the lot description on the page in front of her and then back at the crowd and understood precisely what was happening. They were holding back. Not because the land was not worth bidding on, because they wanted to watch Dale Richmond absorb one more loss, one more lot going below its value, one more number on the wrong side of the ledger. It was not malicious in the way that active cruelty is malicious. It was the passive satisfaction of people who had felt the weight of Dale Richmond's power over the years and were taking the opportunity his absence of power offered. Jenny felt the pull of it. She would not have been human if she had not felt the pull of it. She thought about the coffee cup on Hank Sutton's desk, the letter underneath it, the single word written at the bottom in slightly unsteady handwriting, declined. She thought about a 17-year-old girl leaning into a microphone. She thought about what it meant to do the job right when doing it right cost you something. Then she went to work. She redirected. She changed her angle on the crowd, physically repositioned herself at the podium so that she was addressing the rear left section, directly making the eye contact that carries the specific message that you have been seen and are being spoken to. She found two buyers she had worked before, men she knew had the resources and the interest and were holding back for reasons that had nothing to do with the land itself. She pulled them into the conversation the way an auctioneer pulls a hesitant bidder incrementally, with the rhythm and the redirect and the small escalations that make participation feel inevitable rather than chosen. The bidding opened again. It moved. It went past the reserve and kept moving, the two buyers pushing each other past the point that either had intended to go, the competitive instinct that Jenny had cultivated taking over from the deliberate restraint that had briefly held the room. The lot closed at fair market value. The crowd was quiet for a moment in a different way than it had been quiet before. Jenny recognized the quality of it. It was the quiet of people who had just watched something happen that they had not expected and were still working out what they had seen. She went on to the next lot. The auction closed in the late afternoon. The final numbers were better than Sterling Vance's projections, better than the creditors had expected, better than anyone in the equipment yard, with the possible exception of Jenny herself, had believed the morning would produce. People gathered around her when it was over, buyers shaking her hand. Sterling Vance, with his clipboard and his professional satisfaction, barely contained beneath his careful exterior. Neighboring farmers who had watched her work and were revising their assessments of what a woman who stuttered could accomplish when you gave her a microphone and stood back. She accepted the handshakes and the words without dwelling in them. She was already thinking about the paperwork, about the drive home, about what came next, because there was always something that came next, and the work was the work, whether the day had been ordinary or not. She was beginning to move toward the table where the documentation needed to be completed when she heard a sound behind her. Footsteps on gravel, deliberate and unhurried. She turned. Dale Richmond was walking toward her across the empty space that had opened in the crowd between the auction's end and the beginning of the dispersal. Margaret was not beside him now. He had come alone. He walked with the same deliberate directness he had brought to sitting in the front row all morning, the posture of a man who had decided something and intended to follow through on it, regardless of what it cost him. He stopped in front of her. He was looking at her with the eyes that had not changed in 8 years, sharp and direct, and holding something now that they had not held before, something that had the weight of a long time behind it. He extended his hand. Jenny looked at it for a moment, just a moment, then she took it. "That was the finest auction I have ever seen," he said. His voice was quieter than it had been at the county fair. Not because the capacity was gone, but because the volume had never been the point, and he had finally stopped pretending it was. His voice in this register, without the performance of authority behind it, was the voice of a man of genuine intelligence who had spent decades using that intelligence in the service of his own expansion and was only now, in the aftermath of its failure, beginning to understand what it might have been used for instead. Jenny held his handshake. "I'm sorry it had to be your auction, Mr. Richmond." He shook his head slightly. "I'm not." He looked at her steadily. "I spent years being cruel to you, and you repaid it with integrity." He stopped, swallowed something. "That's not something I would have done. It's what my mentor taught me," Jenny said. She thought of Hank Sutton's voice at the end, reduced to a near whisper, but still carrying, still precise. She thought of the word "declined" on the bottom of a letter under a coffee cup. He said that being decent doesn't pay off right away. Sometimes it takes a long time. He was right. Dale Richmond looked at her for a moment longer. His jaw moved slightly, the movement of a man who has something more to say and is deciding whether to say it. "That day at the county fair," he said finally, "when I laughed at you, I've thought about that day more than you would believe." Jenny waited. "I thought I was setting you straight, saving you from an embarrassment." He paused. "I didn't understand what I was actually watching." "What were you watching?" He let go of her hand. "The most determined person I ever met," he said. "I just didn't have the sense to recognize it." He turned and walked back toward the house where Margaret was waiting, and the afternoon light came across the equipment yard, long and golden, the way late light does in May in Nebraska, when the season has finally committed itself to warmth and everything the light touches looks briefly like something that has been preserved for exactly this moment. Jenny watched him go. She did not call out. She did not add anything to what had already been said, because some things are better left where they land, complete in themselves, not extended or amended or explained. She turned back to Sterling Vance and the documentation table and the work that remained. She never saw Dale Richmond again. She heard through the inevitable channels of county information that he and Margaret moved to Arizona in the fall of 1982, that Margaret's sister had a place there, and that the dry heat was better for Dale's health, which had been declining since before the foreclosure. She heard later that he had died in 1987, 5 years after the auction, in a retirement community outside Tucson. She heard that the obituary in the local paper there described him as a Nebraska farmer and community leader, which was true the way that partial truths are true, containing the facts and rearranging the context that gives them their actual meaning. She hoped in the uncomplicated way that she had learned to hope for things after enough years of understanding how hope works, that the last 5 years had been decent ones, that the Arizona sky had been good to him, that whatever accounting he had done with himself in the years after Madison County had arrived at something he could live with. She had no way of knowing. She went back to work. In the years that followed the Richmond auction, Jenny Caldwell built the kind of career that is difficult to summarize without making it sound simpler than it was, because the work of decades resists compression. She called more than 4,000 auctions, estate sales and livestock auctions and equipment liquidations and charity events. Farm sales during the continuing difficulties of the mid-'80s, when the agricultural crisis that had taken Dale Richmond deepened and spread and swept away operations that had survived for generations. She called those auctions the way she had called the Richmond auction, with the full integrity of the professional method, pushing every lot to its genuine value, giving every seller the best result the market would allow, because that was the job, and she had never understood how to do the job any other way. She was named Nebraska Auctioneer of the Year 3 times. She established a scholarship in Hank Sutton's name, ministered through the Missouri Auction School for students who could not otherwise afford the program. The fund had sent more than 200 young auctioneers into the profession by the time she stopped counting. She ran workshops. Once a year in the spring, she opened the doors of Sutton Auction Services to anyone who wanted to come. Young people with speech impediments, who had been told in the various ways that people are told such things, that the thing they wanted was not available to them. Young women who had been shown to a different door. She taught them what she knew, not just the mechanics of the chant, but the larger thing that contained the mechanics, the understanding that the obstacle and the path are sometimes made of the same material, that the thing which has been limiting you can, with the right framework and enough practice and the willingness to fail, repeatedly in private before succeeding in public, become the thing that distinguishes you. Some of them went on to careers in auctioneering. Some went into broadcasting, into sales, into public speaking, into fields where voice and presence and the ability to read a room are the primary instruments. She tracked them loosely in the way a teacher tracks students, knowing that the relationship between what she taught and what they became was real, even when it was not linear. She was 25 years old when she called the Richmond auction. She was still calling auctions when she was past 60, her voice still carrying across equipment yards and sale barns, with an authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the 25 years of daily practice that had preceded it and the decades of professional application that had followed. The stutter was still there. It would always be there, in ordinary conversation in the grocery store and at the gas station, and in every unremarkable exchange of daily life. The word still caught sometimes. Still required the patient effort of someone navigating a familiar road that has not gotten easier with repetition, only more known. She had made her peace with this so completely and so long ago that she rarely thought about it as a thing requiring peace. Behind the microphone, it simply did not matter. Every August, Jenny Caldwell drove back to Madison County for the fair, not to compete, not to be seen. She sat in the back of whatever tent or open space the talent competition occupied that year, in ordinary clothes, without anything that would identify her to people who did not already know her face, and she watched. She was looking for something specific. She had learned to recognize it the way you learn to recognize anything you have been watching for long enough. A particular quality of stillness before a storm. The specific way a person looks when they are about to do something that everyone around them is going to tell them is impossible. She had found it over the years more than once. A boy with a lisp who wanted to be a radio broadcaster. A girl with a tremor who wanted to be a surgeon. A young man who could barely read aloud, who had decided for reasons he could not fully articulate, but could not be argued out of, that he was going to be a trial lawyer. She approached each of them afterward. before the doubt could fully settle, before the laughter of the crowd had time to become the voice inside their own head. She introduced herself the way she always introduced herself. "My name is Jenny Caldwell." The words came out the way they always came out in ordinary speech, with the slight catch at the beginning, the brief hesitation that was simply part of who she was and always had been and always would be. She watched their faces register it. The stutter. The slight surprise that this woman, whoever she was, spoke with the same impediment they were ashamed of. And then she told them about the county fair tent in August of 1974, and the 200 people who laughed, and the man in the front row who said, "Sweetie," and what she had said back to him, and what the next 8 years had looked like. In the morning of May 15th, 1982, when she had stood at a podium on Dale Richmond's property, and the rhythm had been there exactly where she had put it, undisturbed by everything that had been thrown at it, waiting for her the way it had always waited. She told them what Hank Sutton had told her. The day will come when everything depends on your voice. When you are exhausted, when you are emotional, when the whole world is watching. And on that day, the rhythm has to be so deep in your bones that nothing can shake it loose. She told them that the way to get the rhythm that deep was to practice it every day in the places where nobody was watching, in the bedroom, in the barn, in the truck cab, and every quiet moment that could be carved out of a life that would not always offer many. She told them that the people who laughed were not the point. She told them that the people who tried to stop them were not the point. She told them that the only point, the only thing that would still be standing when everything else had run its course, was the work. The daily, private, unglamorous, magnificent work of becoming the thing you have decided to become. She gave each of them her card. Some called, some didn't. She did not track it as a success rate, because that was not how she thought about it. She thought about it the way Everett Caldwell had thought about putting $400 on a kitchen table for a daughter who needed to go to Kansas City. Watch the words come one after another, smooth and fast and clean, carried on a current that was built in a bedroom in Norfolk, Nebraska, when a girl who could not speak discovered that she could chant, and decided that the distance between those two things was not a wall. It was a door, and she had been walking through it every day since.